Hi, Father Michael.
Hi, Bob.
How are you?
Very good. And yourself this afternoon?
I have no complaints about life right now. Very happy to be able to talk to you. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright. This is The Wright Show, available in both streaming video and via audio podcast. You are Father Michael Holleran. You
Yes.
are, for starters, a priest.
Catholic priest, yes.
At the Church of, I want to say Notre Dame, but it seems like when it's an actual church as opposed to the university, I should say Notre Dame. Is that the preferred pronunciation?
Yes, all the more so because we're the French community, the French-speaking community for the Archdiocese of New York, so it is Notre Dame, very definitely.
Okay, well, there you go. I guessed right. But in addition to that, you is it pronounced sensei?
Sensei.
Sensei, which in the Zen Buddhist tradition means kind of teacher, I guess.
Teacher, yes.
You actually, are you kind of the equivalent of what in Christianity would be called ordained? I mean, you did receive what's called Dharma transmission, right?
So that's right, Dharma transmission. We do have to make the distinction, though. I'm not a Zen priest, which
right.
not formally a Buddhist in that sense of having taken Jukai and the vows and all of that. But in our particular lineage, we can become teachers without having to do all that. Mm-hmm.
Okay, and but in any event, you are serious about your Buddhist practice, well versed in it.
My Zen practice, yes, and as my teacher, who's also a priest, the Jesuit Roshi, Father Robert Kennedy, says, "There's nothing. Zen is not Buddhist. It is historically, and it is in some ways, but it's not. In essence, it's just being real, being present. So it's non-sectarian in that sense, in the deepest sense."
Yeah, certainly. Wouldn't you say that both the practice and the meditative practice within Zen and the philosophy have things in common with Buddhism more broadly?
Yeah, they've come to us from the Buddhist tradition. That's correct.
Right. Okay. So anyway, I want to talk about contemplative tradition broadly, and I know you have an interest not just in contemplative tradition within the Christian community and the Zen community, but even beyond that, and you have a lot of practice. I mean, one interesting thing about you is that you spent 20 or 22 years in a Carthusian.
That's right. 22 years in the Carthusian order, which is the most solitary, the strictest order in the Catholic Church. I was 22 years, 10 of those years in Europe, 7 of them at the Grand Chartreuse, the Mother House, the subject of the documentary Into Great Silence that many have seen, including showed here in New York in 2007. And I commented on it at the theater. So there's that, and I also have done Kundalini meditation study with a teacher, and so I branched at Kabbalah. So I've branched into many streams of the contemplative tradition. Yeah.
Okay, and how close to pure silence were those 22 years? I mean, it was a lot quieter than it is for you now, I guess, right? I mean, what is an average day like in a Carthusian monastery?
Well, it's for the choir monks. We have our own cottages apart, and we live as hermits most of the day. It's a community of hermits, if that's not too much of an oxymoron. So we come together as a community to sing Gregorian chant in church, for Mass in the morning, for morning prayer, for morning prayer and night prayer at midnight, and then evening prayer late in the afternoon. So 3 times a day we come together. The rest of the time, including meals, are by ourselves.
And when you come together to sing, do you also do some actual speaking to each other?
No. That's just the singing. The speaking that we do is primarily on Mondays. Normally Mondays. Once a week we go out for what's called a spaziomentum, a walk in the woods or in the mountains, wherever we are, for about 4 hours. That's our exercise, and that's when we get to speak with each other. But the rest of the time we are strictly silent, except when we're, singing all that Gregorian chant, which I love. My own particular story, though, was a little different because when I was at the Grand Chartreuse, I was in charge of making our famous Chartreuse liqueur.
Which is that's what the color comes from, right? The liqueur itself is kind of bright light green.
Yeah, right. So that particular color was named Chartreuse after our liqueur, not the other way around. And so I had contact with outside, the business world, and so I had to, be engaged with that kind of thing. So I had more contact than most Carthusians with the outside world. Mm-hmm.
So then, for how long were you in the more silent kind of realm?
Well, the whole life was always silent compared to the world, but it was 14 years before I got that job.
Wow.
So,
and it must have been to your liking. You kept it up.
Well, yes, more accurate to say, at least in my experience of it, it was a calling, and I certainly relished it because it was a calling, and I felt definitely led and guided all during all that time. But then I felt guided also out eventually into the world. People always said, well, what a huge transition that must have been to go from there to, actually it was Greenwich Village in Manhattan that I had my first assignment after the monastery.
Yeah, that would be different.
So I said, well, not really. I say both milieu push the boundaries of the human spirit. So
in different ways, possibly.
There you go. Yes.
The idea of a calling is fascinating. I think a lot of people feel it. I guess most people who feel a sense of calling are religious, but probably some aren't. I don't know. But can you tell us kind of what it felt like and when it started? I mean, you were brought up religiously. You went to I think you went to a Jesuit secondary school, right? And then
That's
you went to Jesuit college, Fordham.
Yeah, Jesuit high school, and then I entered the Jesuits. I became a Jesuit right after high school. They don't do that anymore, but at the time they were doing that. And then I went to Fordham as a Jesuit. So for 5 years I was a Jesuit before I went into the Carthusians. So my call to the priesthood predates my call to the monastery. I discovered the interior life as a Jesuit novice, I would say. And that's why when I left the monastery, I stayed a priest, because that was an anterior calling that I had felt. So it's a strong, as Saint Ignatius of Loyola says himself in his rules for the discernment of spirits in his spiritual exercises. It's a long-term, peaceful, joyful, consistent pull in the silent depths of your heart in a particular direction, and that's a good way to discern a call. But it is, and if you're right, it's not just religious. People in my own family, they're musicians or actors. That's a call. Being a doctor is a call. Anything that's deeply discerned as your vocation in life, I think, is a call, and is felt that deeply.
But there was a sense of conviction that it was the right thing to
Yes.
do, and there was a feeling of peace about it when you contemplated doing it, I guess, because it was the right thing to do. Is that
exactly? Yes. Mm-hmm. And an enthusiasm, a deep enthusiasm, a deep desire to do it.
And I've read a little of your writing, kind of about theology, I guess. I mean, you did some writing for Discover magazine.
Yes.
And you wrote a piece about. Well, it was about intelligent design, and the context was it was kind of evolution. But I know you had you put forth some pretty abstract conceptions of God, and also emphasized the unknowability of God. And so I wonder. I mean, the literal the term a calling, I think in probably may originate with a pretty anthropomorphic conception of God, right? There's this being out there that is doing the calling, communicating to you. But in any event, you don't evince that kind of conception of God in your writing. At the same time, I would guess that the sense of calling had a connection to the divine in your mind and in your heart. Is that right?
Oh yes, I mean what you see in the scriptures. I mean the Judeo-Christian scriptures. You actually have depictions of callings, like Moses in the burning bush. You would actually have it's dramatized, so you have clear subject, object, distance, and all of that. But Of course, God, the unknowable God, is in the very depths of everything, fire in the depths and a light in the depths of everything, including our own hearts, including our own being. And it's, consciousness, pure consciousness, if you will, too. So that's how it or he or she or however, that's all anthropomorphic. That's how it speaks to us, at that level of depth in our hearts, and minds. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so by way of segueing to the contemplative tradition, kind of East and West, maybe we should start with the West. There is a contemplative tradition within Christianity. You hear about Christian mystics of the past St. John of the Cross and so on.
Yes.
I've never been all that clear on what they had in common. I think certainly in some cases, some of their experiences might not sound very mystical in an Eastern way. I don't know, but do you, what can we say about what terms like contemplative or mystical mean historically in the Christian tradition?
Yeah, well, I gave an all-day lecture on mysticism as the true face of religion at a Jesuit parish over in Eastern Manhattan just a few weeks ago, going through the Christian mystics all the way back. They're not as well known as they should be, even by those who are spiritual leaders like priests and bishops, better known by researchers or by of course religious and monks and nuns. But there are common elements that you can find in the tradition. Most of all, the silence, the darkness, the unknowability. Nonetheless, this strong sense of contact. The original definition of contemplative prayer by Gregory of Nyssa in the 4th century was a sense of presence, just a sense of presence, of being in connection with a power, a love, a beauty, a being, or being itself, really. And then the fact that we can come into contact with that, or even better, that reality wants to come into contact with us, and there's an intrinsic connection there. We come from that. We're made for that. We call it in the Judeo-Christian tradition being made in the image of God. So there's already a compatibility, if you will, a connaturality there. So, but above all, it's the silence and the unknowability and the need to abandon yourself, let go of your, ultimately what we call today the ego and the false self and all those things that get in the way, which Buddhism is so expert at pointing out to us, as you know.
Yeah. So, William James, I think, defined a mystical experience as noetic but ineffable. In other words, it imparts knowledge, but you can't describe the knowledge. And I guess there's some of that here. You have the conviction that you are in contact with something, and in the Christian tradition, you'd call that the divine, but at the same time, it's not all that clearly articulable. No,
that's right. It's not. It's beyond all words. St. Augustine had a good phrase, si comprehenderis non est Deus. If you've understood it, it's not God. In other words, if you can name it, if it's graspable, then it's by definition not God. So yeah, that's an important element of it. Mm-hmm.
Okay, and so I guess I don't want to really dwell on this, but I guess if the Bible is going to be your scripture and this is going to be your conception of God, obviously you have to depart from a literal reading of the Bible in some places, and I guess you have to do a certain amount of, I guess, in a sense, intellectual work. I mean, to
absolutely,
yeah,
absolutely.
Of what kind?
Well, none of it can be really taken literally. I mean, look at the first chapters of Genesis, for example. I mean, that was unfortunately taken literally, and very unfortunately still taken literally by a lot of Christians. Whereas even the authors themselves, I think it's safe to say, didn't mean it literally. It's a mythic. It's a mythic story. It's an archetypal presentation of certain truths of the human condition, presented in a very dramatic way, but certainly not meant to be taken literally. And the deeper experience you have of God, the more cultural blind spots and blinders and limitations and psychological, obstructions, the clearer they become. And you see it much more in a historical context. Nothing can be taken at face value. It also has to be put through the filter of a deeper experience of God and different levels of revelation, you might say, as well. I think the revelation that God is love is certainly more profound and lasting than, a desert sheik killing his enemies in the promised land, that kind of thing.
And is love a prominent part of the contemplative experience in Christianity, either by definition or frequently?
Very, very frequently, even in past centuries, even more so now, it's being brought to the fore that love is the very energy of the universe, as Teilhard de Chardin would say, the Jesuit mystic and scientist. And that is the experience across traditions too. We get into compassion and loving kindness in the Eastern traditions. So yes, if you're not experiencing all-embracing and all-encompassing love, encompassing yourself as well, then you haven't had the experience. A mystical experience, which by definition is a direct experience of the absolute reality, or fruitive experience of the absolute reality.
Okay, so before you happened upon Zen, you were, I gather, quite familiar with this kind of contemplative experience. I would assume in the monastery that was part of the idea. I would assume that even were the chants themselves, was that, or at least could it be on occasion a kind of a mystical exercise?
Oh, it certainly can be. I mean, it certainly, I believe it flows from, a deep, perhaps mystical experience of God, and that it leads to it if it's properly done. I was familiar with it, but what I discovered was, and Thomas Merton, the famous Trappist mystic in the 20th century, we discovered that even in the monasteries, they'd lost the contemplative thread. They'd lost the wisdom thread of actually being able to pass on the practice of contemplative prayer and the wisdom of contemplative prayer from generation to generation. All we were told, was follow the rule, and even in the Christian theological anthropology that was popular up until recent decades, it was about the will dominating the passions and the mind governing, the body, and this kind of thing, which is not helpful at all and can be psychologically very detrimental. That's why, and this is something that Paul Knitter quotes in his book when he talked to me about this, without Buddha I could not be a Christian. The actual wisdom, practical wisdom of contemplation has really been lacking up until recent decades in the West, in the Christian West. And that's part of the reason I went to the riches of the East, the chakras and all these wonderful techniques which show great wisdom and understanding of, the energy centers and the human person. There's nothing dangerous or pagan or demonic about that. It's natural. That's the way we're made, as we discover. And so there are wonderful techniques for marshaling all that and purifying all that and harmonizing and integrating all that so the contemplative experience can be fuller and richer and deeper and truer.
Okay, so I think, when people think of contemplative practice in the Zen or more broadly Buddhist context, they have kind of a clear idea that there is an exercise. You kind of sit down, typically you'd cross your legs, and then you would probably focus on something, maybe your breath, maybe a mantra or something. But I think in Christianity, there's not such a clear idea of like a specific practice intended to cultivate contemplative insight. I'm wondering, there is something called centering prayer, which maybe you could talk about. But I'm also wondering, was there a practice in the monastery? There was chanting and so on. Was there an individualized practice that was like prescribed?
No, there wasn't. We were told in my generation anyway, just to go and follow whichever spirituality you like. Let the cell, your own living space teach you. No, there was nothing very clear. There have been certain practice, like the Jesus prayer in the East. The Eastern Christianity has the Jesus prayer very prominently. It's a mantra type of prayer in its format. And there have been the Carmelites had a certain style of prayer. The Jesuits certainly did, as I've been saying. Centering prayer is I also lead a group of centering prayer in my parish here every week, and it's been proved very useful and attractive to many Christian contemplatives. It's basically following a 15th century book called a treatise called The Cloud of Unknowing. It refers back to Sinai and the cloud over Mount Tabor and all this, where you go into the silence and you simply surrender to the action and the presence of God within you, and you use a word, not as a mantra, but simply as a tool to return to that silent presence, the silent surrender every time your mind runs away with you, which happens, every 1.5 seconds, as you know. So it's a very simple, useful tool, which, contrary to the fears of some more conservative Catholics, is very traditional, goes back 500 years, and is rooted in the contemplative tradition of Christianity.
Okay. And the centering prayer does involve kind of the mental repetition of an important word, I gather, such as Jesus, right?
Actually, no. There is another school, the John Main School, World Community of Christian Meditation, which uses a mantra more intentionally.
I see.
The only function the word has, a word like let go or silence or faith or whatever word you choose, it's simply to refocus on the silence.
Okay.
Only when it's needed. When it's needed.
I see.
Not systematic.
Find your mind wandering, then you return it to the word, but then you don't need the word until your mind wanders again.
That's right.
So, okay, so, and as long as we're mentioning things you do regularly, okay, so you do the centering prayer thing there in New York, but people in New York may also be interested in what you do at St. Francis of Assisi, right? You still,
yes.
You do a Zen thing there?
Yeah, so every, and this is going on for a number of years now already. It's technically part of their adult faith formation program, but they host my Dragon's Eye Zendo, which I founded almost 10 years ago after I became a teacher, and it's currently located there, as it has been for a number of years. Every Thursday at 6 p.m., we meet in the main hall there, which is a wonderful space, very quiet and very spacious. And we have, a regular hour and a half Zen session there where I give a talk at the end, etc. So, yes.
Okay. And how did you happen upon Zen originally?
Well, it's hard to say. I was exposed to it, I guess, originally as a Jesuit when Thomas Merton was still writing about it, was first writing about it in the late 60s, just before he died. And I was interested in Eastern religions even as a student at Fordham, and one of my teachers was the man who eventually gave me Dharma transmission, 50 years later. But it was partly because I recognized that the contemplative banquet was rather sparse in the monastery. I knew I needed to explore other things, not just Zen or yoga or Kabbalah, but psychology, Jung. I needed to explore, just the world and other theological traditions and other religious traditions, which I couldn't do in the monastery.
And do you remember some of the early meditative experiences in the context of Zen that convinced you that, yes, this was worth continuing to pursue?
Well, that's an interesting point. I sat, regularly with a Zendo, currently still being run by one of the teachers in my lineage, Janet and Greg Abels, in Manhattan. But I just knew it was the right thing. I didn't have any overwhelming experiences until about 8 years into it. But I just knew that this was it. And it was doing something for me. It was sustaining a certain level of awareness. It was nourishing me through hidden channels. So without an overwhelmingly convincing experience, I still knew somehow that this was it. Maybe that's part of what a calling means. Yeah,
I was going to say, so this was a continued, a sustained sense of calling toward this practice. I mean, I assume there was some kind of positive reinforcement.
Oh, sure. The basic experience was positive. But it just wasn't like this thunder and lightning, revelation on Mount Sinai kind of thing,
And then you eventually had more dramatic experiences?
Yes. Dramatic, if you want to call it that. I mean, very simple, very deep, but very overpowering, yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay, with the understanding that ultimately they are almost by definition hard to articulate, do you want to take a stab at articulating them?
Well, it's basically it is almost impossible to speak about, but it's a strong sense of energy, of being filled with light and love and joy and power, extending all through your being, every facet of your being, and then out into the world, and then realizing that the world isn't separate from you to begin with, nor is anybody else. It's all one. That's a strong experience of that there is a basic unity and a basic union, a communion, unity, which is love, energy. That's very much a part of the experience as one goes forward.
Mm-hmm. So there was a greater sense of continuity with the world you had previously considered outside of you.
Yes, definitely, yes, and that's another reason I didn't need to stay in the monastery, because there was nothing foreign to me. There was nothing that was intrinsically dangerous. It was all part of what I needed to connect to, because we're supposed to connect with everything and everyone. You can do it in the monastery, but I just found it a richer experience to do it on the outside, and also more challenging. Mm-hmm. One of the dangers, I think, of monastic life is that you're never challenged by any other person or opinion or event. It can be a little too cozy for you. Community itself is a challenge, mind you, in the monastery, but there's a much broader and wider challenge on the outside. And I felt, and personally, I needed that to continue to grow.
Now, the experience of, kind of the dissolution of the bounds between the self and the outside world in meditation is often talked about in the context of the Buddhist doctrine of not self.
Yes.
Right? The idea, there is this metaphysical notion in Buddhism that the self does not exist, certainly not as we think of it. And this is... this kind of experience is taken as a kind of experiential apprehension of the truth of that doctrine, right?
Yeah, you realize you're not who you think you are. Fortunately, and with great enthusiasm and sense of liberation, you realize you quotes are much more than all that. I liked it in your recent book, Why Buddhism is True. You bring up the point. Well, is this just nothing? I mean, is it no self? Or can you call it the self, the true self, or Atman or Brahman? And I agree with you when you say that it doesn't really matter which way you talk about it. It's just that it's something way bigger than you thought you were, however you want to conceptualize it. That was also an experience I had in an interfaith group I was working with for a number of years. A Zen Buddhist and a Hindu yogi were arguing about this very point, and eventually they agreed. Well, it's the same thing, and experientially, as soon as you put a label on it, you're going to argue about labels and definitions, which is why we can never come together on the level of words and doctrines. Whereas on the level of experience, it's not really different. We would propose. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I want to say that when I invited you on the show, I did not know you had read my book. So this was not a crass attempt at, at self-promotion, or not self-promotion, as we say in Buddhism. But I want to dwell on that point a little. This Hindu versus Buddhism kind of interpretation of this kind of mystical experience is interesting. I mean, in Hinduism, it's more often put like that this is a union of the self, the Atman, the individual soul, with the kind of universal soul, the divine Brahman. And in Buddhism, it would be conventionally interpreted more as, as I said, since the self doesn't exist, it would be thought of more almost as a continuity of emptiness between what you previously thought of as yourself and the outside world. I mean, emptiness is it's a translation of a technical Buddhist term, and it might mislead people.
It does, because it could just as easily be translated as fullness, everything, everything.
Well, that's kind of the point. Is that that you can look at it the Hindu way, I am being united with the universal, the divine, the universal soul, or you can say there was just, you can put it the other way, but I think you and I both suspect that the experience that the Hindu mystic is having is similar, maybe fundamentally the same as the experience the Buddhist mystic is having, and it raises the question of how different is it from the experience that the Christian mystic is having?
Yeah, well, I would agree with all of that. And of course, the Hindu doesn't say, "Well, I am now one with the." No, the I disappears. That's the whole point. That level is gone. It is the fullness, the union. Even Christian mystics today, like Richard Rohr, are using the phrase Advaita, non-duality. I think it's an excellent word that can go across traditions. We're not one, we're not two. There's no separation, but that's not a monism either. It's not just a total identification. On the level of Christianity, and I think we can use our Christian terms. Just as you can call the Brahman, you can call Buddha mind. Well, I can call it the Christ self, the cosmic Christ. You call it the Holy Spirit. That kind of experience is the experience of the Holy Spirit of God, given by the Spirit of God, transformed in and by the Spirit of God. Sure, you can, and I do believe that again, to use Christian terminology, even Catholic terminology, the Holy Spirit is at work everywhere. The heart of Christ is at work everywhere. And so any experience that is had of union with God, we Christians would say, well, it's through Christ and the Spirit. But the names, I'm convinced that they're not up there saying, well, I want my due. You have to name me. I don't think so. Yeah. The important thing is just to radiate the love. That's the very definition of God. Just to radiate that love.
Right, which raises the question of whether, theology aside, there might be a kind of a moral common denominator here. I mean,
well, I think so. I mean, that's my experience and that's my conviction. People can have different views and interfaith views. So they say, well, they're pointing in the same direction. Maybe they're not exactly the same experience. Well, I guess we can't really know for sure unless you're in the other person's shoes. Of course, we should be non-duality with everyone, but still, it's true. We can't be exactly sure, but judging from for the descriptions of the experience and the results of the experience, it's very, very similar, if not the same. Yes.
Yeah. Well, I guess I was alluding to the results of the experience. In other words, if you really do feel a deep sense of continuity with what's out there, including other beings, you would think that it would be a little harder to harm them intentionally, and you might even feel a sense of deep love, compassion, whatever.
Well, that's right, and you point that out in your book, talking with Judson Brewer, who's also a very good friend of mine, the neuroscientist who's now at Brown. That why would there be wars? Why would you chop off your own hand? Why would you hurt your own being? I mean, if you're one with everyone, well, there's no separation. So you're just spiting. Chopping off your nose, you spite your face. And this fits perfectly with the St. Paul's New Testament doctrine of the body of Christ. We're all one body, so the hand can't say to the foot, I don't need you, or if one member suffers, they all suffer. It's exactly the same thing. We are all one reality, and we want to take care of ourselves. Love your neighbor as yourself, because it is yourself.
Has the experience you've had in the context of Zen, has that influenced your Christian theology or anything about your conception of Christianity?
Yes, I mean it's softened the edges of some of the formulations and dogmatic formulations. I don't contest any of them. I can see if anything, even more clearly the basic truth of it. But the inadequacy and the hard edges, and the static quality of some of these things. I have a much more stronger sense, like some theologians, like Ilia de Leo, the Franciscan, of the God is a verb and not a noun. The energy and the power and the joy and the surge. This is who God is. It's not some guy sitting on a throne up there or some abstract trinity. It's a dynamic reality.
Mm-hmm. Now, is this Is what you're doing part of kind of a discernible movement? In other words, are more and more people making these kinds of connections, between East and West? I know you were influenced by Paul Knitter, whom I know a little, and whose book you mentioned earlier, "Without Buddha, I Could Not Be a Christian."
Yes,
I think he has a term for something about I don't
double
have it
belonging.
Right.
Double belonging.
Yeah, double belonging.
Yeah.
What does that mean?
Well, I think that's a wonderful phrase, and we've talked about it a lot. I assisted in his classes, and he's a good friend of mine. But he means by that, and he explained it very well in class one day, I remember. You have a basic commitment and a basic rootedness in one tradition, and it's normally, though not always, the one in which you were raised. But in his phrase, you get substantial nourishment from another tradition or other traditions, double, triple, quadruple belonging. So in other words, you do remain rooted in a primary tradition, as I do in Christianity, but you get more than incidental nourishment. It's not just an intellectual, dilettantish, curiosity. It's an actual nourishment from other traditions. The great religious scholar Houston Smith, who wrote The World Religions, he's a wonderful, wonderful example of this. Someone who was enthusiastically Christian, but enthusiastically tried other traditions as well. He tried Zen, he tried, Islam, Native Americans. So that's the kind of thing we're talking about.
And do you sense it gathering momentum? Is more and more of this happening?
Well, I think so. It's certainly the movement among those who are interested in it. And it's certainly the movement of evolution. We're getting a sense of, theology and the whole universe evolving, a global community. As you know, if you look around politically in the world and even in religions in the world, there's a lot of resistance to this as tribalism and fear and ignorance reassert themselves. So I can't tell you the exact quota or the exact proportion, how much it's growing or among whom or how successfully, but it certainly is the wave of the future.
Yeah. You're getting right. I gathered. Well, tell me this. You're doing these two things. You're doing the Zendo thing each week. You're also doing the centering prayer thing. The first is at the Church of St. Francis of Assisi, the second at Notre Dame. Are there people who are crossover, who are like attending both?
That's right. There are a number who do both. There are, yes. Mm-hmm.
So you have a community that is an example of this.
Oh, that's true. Yes, and often just regular parishioners. Not anybody with an advanced degree or anything like that, but some people who are just interested in the spiritual life. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned the word evolution there. I think somewhere I've gotten something you wrote about evolution in the biological sense. It was in one of these pieces you wrote for Discover. The laws of evolution, this is you writing, the laws of evolution, whatever they may be, are not in competition with God, but are a reflection and revelation of God's richness.
Yes. So I really don't understand why so many Christians, more fundamentalist Christians, find evolution so threatening. Maybe it's because they take 6,000 years and 6 days of creation so literally. I don't know, but it's all coming from God anyway, in such glorious majesty and in an unfurling, in stage after stage. It's just a marvelous symphony. Why would anyone find that threatening to the dignity or the majesty or the power of God?
I mean, it does. It is commonly said that it highlights the so-called theodicy, the problem of evil. Natural selection involves a certain amount of suffering, death, killing. I mean, on the other hand, so does the world as we see it. So it's not as if evolution, emphasizing evolution's connection to divinity, would uniquely highlight the problem of evil. But it does. And I doubt that that's a source of fundamentalist resistance to what you're saying, but it's an issue.
I'm not so sure. Right? Well, you do. That's another point you brought up in your book about natural. I thought that was the most original aspect, was the natural selection as being behind some of the insights of the Buddha and suffering, etc. But I often point this out. Look, we say God is omnipotent, but even God, or maybe especially God. God cannot create a world of space and time and chance and matter and free will without life and death, without suffering, without pain, and without the possibility of sin. It can't. But God's answer to that, at least in the Christian revelation, the Christian view, is that, well, God came to share it and to say it's okay, even in the midst of all this and undergoing himself the most cruel and unjust death of all, among the most cruel and unjust deaths imaginable, still saying it's going to come out on the other side and it's still worth it, and it's going to actually bring forth greater compassion, greater love, greater self-giving, greater sacrifice, a greater advancement to the true self, precisely through all the struggle and the sin and the injustice and the fighting for a better world, the kingdom of God as he saw it. So it makes perfect sense to me. In other words, he couldn't have created a world other than that, and B, he came to share it. He shares it with us and shows by that it's worth it. It's worth it. And I think that's the genius of the Christian answer.
Couldn't have created a world without suffering if she wanted to create a world with free will. That's what you mean?
Not just free will, but space and time and matter and chance and all those things that work together. Yes, that's right. And then life and death. He couldn't create a world like this without death. Things get born and they die and they pass. It's a world of time. So embrace it, go with the flow, and that's again very Buddhist, but very Christian too. It's very contemplative, I think. Don't resist. Let the beauty of it in its transience and its ephemeral quality, let the beauty tantalize you and hypnotize you and mesmerize you and nourish you. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Of course, it's harder to say when you're suffering acutely, but
yes,
one thing Buddhism does is try to help you suffer less acutely.
And part of the noble truth is stop resisting. Stop resisting change. Stop clinging. Stop wanting it to be otherwise. You're just creating suffering for yourself. At most, some say, and I think there's truth to it, that most suffering is just created. It's optional. It's created by humans themselves.
Mm-hmm. Now, so I think that's one thing Buddhism has more than Christianity is an actual kind of procedure for reckoning with suffering in a practical sense. That is to say, to minimize unnecessary suffering.
Yes, I think so. I think it's clearer and simpler in Buddhism, yes.
And then what does Christianity have that's particularly important to you that Buddhism doesn't have? You may have just alluded to it when you talked about how the kind of the Christ story is maybe part of you're integrating yourself with the world as it is or something, but I don't want to put words in your mouth. What are the important things that Christianity brings to you that Buddhism or Zen by itself wouldn't?
Well, there, you did just say it. Primarily Jesus himself. I mean, that's a living reality to me. and it's not there by name. We've talked a little bit about it, how it might be operative anyway. But it's not there by name in Buddhism. And the community, the sacraments, the liturgy itself is a wonderful archetypal, mystical experience if you perform it and live it rightly. So all these elements are very, very rich contributions of Christianity. But as you say, it's the Trinitarian God and Christ, the Christ himself, who is the primary, and has always been for me the primary lure. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And Christ, I hadn't really thought of it this way before, but of the Trinity, the Christ part is the part that in a certain sense has most in common with Buddhism, precisely because, as you said, that the Christ story is part of the reckoning with suffering in the Christian tradition.
Yes, and you could almost say that emptiness is the Father and form is Christ. I mean, there's the manifestation of the emptiness. It's the manifestation in this world of the absolute, unknowable absolute, and then the Spirit is the energy that connects the two and connects all of creation back with the absolute. I would look at it that way.
Yeah, and there is this famous Buddhist sutra. The Heart Sutra, I guess, which it is said, as translated, form is emptiness and emptiness is form. Now we
that's what we
needn't dwell on what that might exactly have meant in an original context, but it's in a straightforward sense. consistent with the Christian rendering of it you just did, where part of the Trinity is form, part is emptiness.
Yeah, well, that's what I was quoting, the Heart Sutra. Yeah. So that fundamental doctrine of Mahayana Buddhism, anyway.
Yeah.
So many schools in Buddhism as there are in Christianity, which complicates things. Well, we'll try to see it as a richness too, but
it does complicate things. One more thing on evolution. You, in the piece I mentioned of yours, you did mention Teilhard de Chardin, and you've mentioned him in this very conversation. Just quickly for people who don't know, he was a paleontologist, but also a Jesuit theologian in the early 20th century. Yes. He saw evolution as heading towards something, not just biological evolution, but kind of technological evolution, cultural evolution. In some ways, he envisioned the information age, you could say. He saw that we were building this kind of global brain. He used the noosphere. The noosphere, N-O-O-S. Is Teilhard a very important figure for you?
Oh, he always has been. I mean, I was 18 years old as a young Jesuit. His writings were almost a Bible for me. I just found the energy, the mystical vision, the eloquence, the beauty of it completely hypnotizing, and it has continued to be. Has continued to be throughout my career. Now, as I said, I quoted Ilya Delio, the other theologians who quote him quite a bit now because he has the strong evolutionary sense of God's movement in the world and inclusion of the world. The Omega point he called was the final fulfillment back, if you want, of the world going back into the absolute, to rejoin other traditions like the Kabbalah who say the same thing. But for him, it was the risen Christ, the cosmic Christ. And back in 1940, or 50, when he was writing, that was pretty bold. Nobody talked about the cosmic Christ back in those days, oddly enough, because St. Paul does all over the place in the New Testament. And that's what I'm kind of trying to bring out more and more. This vision, this cosmic vision of Christ, of the risen Christ, which St. Paul is very clear about, and which Teilhard is clear about, and which I think we can experience.
What are some phrases of the Apostle Paul's that you from his epistles that you would say show him to be on the same page as Teilhard in this?
Well, for example, I think the last line of chapter 1 to the Ephesians, where he says, the church, the body of him, the fullness of him who fills the universe in all its parts. And to the Colossians, he says, Christ is all in all. So if he fills the universe in all its parts, and he's everything in everything, how is that not cosmic? How is that not everything? So it's just so obvious if you are attuned to it and you look for it. Okay.
So I want to quickly ask something about the Kabbalah, because it is commonly said pretty much all the major religions have a mystical tradition.
Yes.
For Judaism, Kabbalah is the thing that is cited.
Yes.
I've never had a very clear understanding of it. I mean, I know when I've looked into it, one thing I've discovered is that there's this whole thing of like finding codes in the biblical text. I don't mean codes just in the sense of allegory, but I mean actual like sequences of patterns of letters that, you need a kind of decoder to interpret, right?
Well, first of all, a disclaimer, I'm not an expert who can speak authoritatively on the Kabbalah as I would more readily do in Zen or in Catholicism. But that said, what you just referred to there, I think is a theory, about, hidden codes, in the letters themselves. I'm not so sure about that. And it's very difficult to find clear and persuasive things on the Kabbalah. It's so much out there and so much that's so confusing. But I have managed to find some good things. Just to address the point you made, if you can find hidden mysteries, like the two creation accounts. There are actually two creation accounts, as modern scholars know. The first chapter and the second chapter of Genesis are two separate accounts that were brought together. And the Kabbalah has always known that, and then said, well, the first one is Beriya, God created. That's what Beriya means, creation. The third one is formation, Yetzirah, God formed out of the dust of the earth. And those are two levels of reality in the Kabbalah, which is universally admitted. So they see the cosmology of the mystical tradition right there in the scripture, in the very vocabulary of it. So that's a good example.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So there isn't a contemplative practice associated with Kabbalah, or?
Well, there are, and for example, you can, and there are books written by this. I have one or two. You can actually use the letters of the alphabet, as contemplative, almost like mandalas, to meditate on them. And they're very powerful. As you know, the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet are often compared to or connected to the 22 arcana of the Tarot, which is Torah backwards. So there's some interesting connections there in history.
And I should say that what I said about Kabbalah may be entirely wrong. I'm certainly further from being a scholar of it than you are. Finally, I just wanted to ask you, I noticed that you, I guess, compiled a book called The Wound of Love some years ago.
That's right.
Which I gather drew on something from the Carthusian tradition.
Yeah, so what I did, I was still in the monastery. It was a year or so before I left the monastery. I collated a number of sermons that were given by the Father General of the Carthusians and also by certain others. The novice master, for example, with whom I was friendly. And so I chose on certain themes a particularly insightful sermon that might have been given on a feast day, and then I was an anthology of those things. Yeah.
And are you ever tempted to return to, like, on a particularly hectic urban day? Are you ever kind of nostalgic about the pace of life or the texture of life back in the monastery?
Not for a microsecond.
Why is that?
Well, mainly because I don't have the call, but also because I just, I'm not meant to be there anymore. And even on a difficult day, I still am nourished by the energy and the challenge of life. So I'm happy following my call now.
So it sounds like you had the conviction pretty much your whole life that the thing you were doing at the time was the right thing to be doing, which must be reassuring.
You're right. It is, and I do have had that conviction, despite or in the midst of all the changes. I have always felt that.
Well, that's. I think you should count yourself lucky. There's some people who never have that.
I guess so. I don't know if it needs to be that way or why that is, but I'm certainly grateful that I have had that grace. Let us call it.
Yeah. Well, listen, thank you for taking the time. Is there a place that people can find your work online? I mean, you have a website, right? You have.
Yes, it's michaelkholleran.org or .com. And mostly what you find on there, you find a few of my writings as you have, but mainly what you find there are my Dharma talks, my teishos, and my sermons, my actual Sunday sermons from my church. There got to be a couple hundred of them up there. So you can find a lot of material there. Also workshops I've given and talks I've given in various places.
Okay. And again, people who live in Manhattan have each week have at least two ways to cross paths.
That's right. Yeah, 7:30 on Mondays at my church and 6 o'clock on Thursdays at St. Francis of Assisi for the Zendo.
Okay, so the first of those is the centering prayer specifically, or are you talking about?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much, Father Michael.
Well, thank you for your curiosity and for your questions and for your work. Thank you so much for moving the spiritual evolution of humanity forward.
Well, we're all doing our best, and thank you for satisfying my curiosity.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Okay.